Oh, snap. Just kidding. Was that in bad taste? Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Hello. We are back at it with the BloomBurrrow set review just in time before the release. Even though you've seen some creators having early access to the expansion, I did not. Sucks to be me. So I'm going to be ready for July 30th, giving you guys deck lists and all that stuff. But we still have some cards to cover. I have not uploaded these past few days for some personal reasons. Not really going to dive into it because, you know, it's just personal stuff. I did mention a little bit about it on Twitter. But, yeah, I needed a few days to kind of like recompose myself, I guess. So, yeah, we're back at it. And today we're going to be going over the color green. Timmy's favorite color. What are we expecting from green in BloomBurrrow? Well, rabbits, raccoons, frogs, and squirrels. Very impressed by the raccoons and the squirrels in this set. We're going to go over the cards. Without further ado, let's just jump into it because I always take forever in these videos. And hopefully, yeah, maybe today's the day that I'm actually more concise and the video's not that long. But we got a lot of cards to talk about. So, why do I keep saying this, man? Like, I never... nothing ever changes in essence. I am on some mad copium with that. Okay, let's cover the Baker's Bane duo first. 2 mana, 2/2 Squirrel Raccoon. It's a squirrel and a raccoon, in case you're wondering. It's not just like a hybrid of the two. You can see that the squirrel is sitting on his shoulder. The Baker's Bane duo is a 2 mana 2/2 that says when it enters, create a food token, and then when you expend 4. Baker's Bane duo gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. So not a +1/+1 counter, but a temporary boost, rather. This is a common card, but I think this card could potentially be rather decent because it is spawning you a food token, and within the BloomBurrrow expansion, there's a lot of synergy with food. Specifically in green, but also outside of it as well. It's all over the place, right? So you could definitely make a lot of food decks, and having a 2-drop that generates you a food token is not that easy to find, though I may be wrong and there may be some better options. Overall, I think for green, this is not that bad of a card, actually. I do think it's better than this one that's uncommon, which is the Bark Knuckle Boxer. 2 mana 3/2 that whenever you expend 4, Bark Knuckle Boxer gains indestructible into the end of turn. I think this Berserker Raccoon is actually ultimately inferior to the Baker's Bane duo because getting that food token out of that, even if you have 1 less power, you know, and you get like stat growths, which I argue is better than like an expend dependent indestructible proc. I do think Duo will be ultimately more viable than this card. This card looks really cool. It has a lot going on for it, but I'm not really impressed with it, to be honest. I am impressed, however, by the Bramble Guard Veteran. Another raccoon, ladies and gentlemen. This time a warrior. 3 mana, 3/4. Whenever you expend 4 raccoons you control, get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until the end of turn. We have the Raccoon Tribal 3-drop here that it seems like a lot of raccoons are synergizing with the expend mechanic. In case you're unfamiliar with this one, I've explained it before, but as it says there, you expend 4 as you spend your 4th total mana. What? Your 4th total mana to cast spells during a turn, whether it's your turn or your opponent's turn. If you spend 4 mana, you know, whether it's like more or exactly that, it's relevant. As long as you spend 4 mana, you will be able to trigger the expend. And with a card like this, you can boost up your entire board and give all of your raccoons vigilance as well, which allows you to go for a reckless attack without leaving yourself wide open to a retaliation, which is really neat. And the stat line for 3 mana, 3/4, I mean, that's kind of like what green does. Provides you a lot of stats on your creatures, hence the Timmy faction. Very solid card. And if there is a raccoon deck, which I expect there will be, a pretty good one, this card will be pretty much an auto-include, I think. As then we have the Bushy Bodyguard, a 2 mana squirrel warrior with Offspring 2. Again, to remind you guys, Offspring allows you to, essentially, if you pay the cost, you get to spawn a 1/1 token copy of the creature you're playing with Offspring. So for 4 mana, you can get the Bushy Bodyguard and a 1/1 token copy of it. When this creature enters, you may forage. If you do, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So foraging means exiling 3 cards from your graveyard or eating a food, sacrificing a food rather, which makes it so that if you pay 4 mana for this and you forage for both, you get a 4/3 and a 3/3 Squirrel Warrior. So that's a very big tempo play. More so if you have a deck that synergizes with Squirrels. This could be a legitimate 2-drop. It doesn't seem like much at first, but it really... It matches the value when it offsprings, right? So it's not cheap as a play. And if you incorporate this into your deck, you may actually count it more as a 4-drop than as a 2-drop because of the offspring. But I think that there is enough synergy, you know, for Squirrels and for spread out board states that this can be a legit creature to go for in the standard. We'll see. I'll definitely be trying it out for sure. As then we got Cache. I have trouble pronouncing this word. I actually pronounced this word a lot when I was covering Marvel Snap. And I kept calling it Cache. But I've been told it's Cash. Okay? Correct me if I'm wrong. The way you pronounce this word is Cash. Cash Grab, which sounds the same as Cash Grab, so I'm kind of confused. Again, correct me. Is a 2-mana instant common that allows you to mill 4 cards. That's not very common in green, to be able to mill 4 cards like this. I mean, you do have the Investigator, right? Like the 2-mana Investigator that mills 3 cards upon entry. So you do have that as a 1/3, but you could possibly run that card alongside this card as well, and really enabling you to fill up your graveyard really quickly. As you mill 4 cards, you may put a permanent card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. This includes lands, in case you're wondering. Land cards are permanents, so are creatures, artifacts, enchantments. Instants and sorceries don't count. Siege or battle as well. If you could draw a squirrel or return a squirrel card to your hand this way, create a food token. I think this card is really solid in the right deck. Obviously, it's a synergy dependent card, but in the proper build, I don't know what more you want out of this. It's filling up your graveyard. It's allowing you to cycle through your deck. It's allowing you to fish for something out of the cards that you potentially milled. So basically, you're looking at it, like this mill effect is equivalent to like looking at the top 4 cards of your deck and then picking a permanent card and putting it into your hand, right? The thing is, you're sending these cards to the graveyard first, and then you're returning it to your hand, which is arguably better because that broadens the spectrum of cards that this card can combine with. Because you're first sending that to the graveyard and then you're picking it up, but you're not losing card advantage. You're searching for something. And if you run a squirrel-based deck and you return a squirrel, you on top of that generate a food token. So I do think this card will be very much playable, but it has to be a specific deck that has proper graveyard interaction and squirrels and food synergy. So these are 3 things that it's easier than done to like align them, and we'll see how the expansion itself plays into a card like this. But I definitely think it'll be played in the proper build. As then we got Clifftop Lookout, a ramp frog, ladies and gentlemen. 3 mana, 1/2, super understated, but has reach, which allows you to block or chump block rather into big flyers potentially, or you know, not let the bats, for example, just ping at your health freely, right? And for this very low stat, you're getting a very neat ability, which allows you to, like I said, ramp. When it enters the battlefield, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. There's no max. Like, if you play this card, you will reveal cards until you find a land. You put that card into the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If this card sent all the other cards to the graveyard, it could be a very dangerous card, because there will be some graveyard-centric decks that could really capitalize of such a strong effect like this. But it's not. It's just fetching you for a land. It's a frog that allows you to ramp. And because it's a frog, it synergizes with a bunch of other frogs within Bloomburrow that seem to have the theme of bouncing, which makes sense. Frogs bounce. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. So with frogs... this is a very nice target to bounce, because if you do so, you are re-triggering this very powerful upon entry effect that will allow you to ramp again. So I've been mentioning stuff like Orzhov Bounce, but now with blue and green in the mix, I think we may be looking at something like Simic or Bant Bounce being a thing with Bloomburrow, and I am all for it. We got the Curious Forager, a 3-mana Squirrel Druid with a terrible resolution on the card, but, you know, I think you can make of it. When it enters the battlefield, you may forage, which means you exile 3 cards or you sacrifice a food. When you do, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. A 3-mana 3/2. I'm not particularly impressed by this effect, just because compare this to Honest Rustine, a Golgari 3-drop that doesn't need you to do anything. Upon entry, he will automatically return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, and will reduce the cost of all your creatures by 1. And that card doesn't see as much play as you would think it does. So this card, yeah, it does allow you to return a permanent, which, you know, broadens the pool of cards you can target with this. But I don't know. I feel like, I mean, if you have a squirrel build, naturally this kind of effect is useful, because we have seen squirrel designs that, you know, mill. Like we just talked about this cash grab right here, right? So I do think that this card will be played. I think this card in a vacuum is underwhelming, but I do think it may end up being a very important piece to squirrel builds, just because it's a squirrel, right? And I think, you know, one of the ways I like them being like more responsible with the power level at which they released cards. I've heard that there's been a lot of power creep going on in Magic. Those standards in a great spot, in my opinion. But it's always nice for them to just make sure that nothing is just like too crazy or too pushed. And I think this card is a neat example of that. I do think it'll potentially see play in those kind of builds, but it's not crazy. At least, maybe it's crazier than I think. Like maybe in a deck with like bouncing mechanics and stuff, like this can allow you to just keep going. But I don't know. I think it's pretty all right, basically. As then we got Druid of the Spade, a 3-mana 2/3. As long as you control a token, Druid of the Spade gets +2 power and has trample. Limited card. It's a common. You know, the power ceiling is quite, you know, at its best. It's a 4/3 with trample, but you have to control a token, and you know, like having your card be a 4/3 with trample at best. The Rabbit Tribal has to do a lot here to make this card even worth considering for standard. And I don't think that'll be the case. As then we got Fecund Greenshell, another horrendous screenshot on this card, but I think you can make it out. I'll help you out here. It's a turtle. It's a turtle. And it's got like leaves and stuff on its back. And it is a 5-mana 4/6, not a bad stat line, with reach. I don't know how this thing, oh, I guess it shoots like spores out of his back. Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. As long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2. That is a crazy board boost, but naturally, you need to have 10 lands. How do you get there? Well, I think we can all expect the last portion of this text to be land related, right? And yeah, it is. Whenever Fecund Greenshell or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, put it into your hand. So this enters the board, allows you to ramp. Anything else that comes onto the board that has more toughness than power will allow you to ramp. As you see in the text here, it says whenever Fecund Greenshell or another creature you control enters. It doesn't say once per turn. So if you're in a situation where you play this and then you untap with it and you're able to develop multiple creatures that meet this requirement, you could ramp an insane amount of lands. But of course, we're talking about turn 6 here. At turn 6, you're supposed to be able to do some strong shit. And, I mean, obviously, I say turn 6, but, you know, if you run a deck like this, you have other means of ramp incorporated, right? But something that comes to mind with the Fecund Greenshell is that you can combine it with the Clifftop Lookout, and that's already, like, super easy, really good synergy. This thing comes in, and it has more toughness than power, which means that the Clifftop Lookout synergizes with the Greenshell here, because let's go over it again. When this thing or another creature control with toughness greater than power enters, you look at the top card of your library. So you look at the top card of your library, so the ramp is not guaranteed, right? But it's pretty wild nonetheless, because you can combine this with like surveil effects, scrying effects, and you can just do some serious ramping. And the ability to like play something like Clifftop Lookout, even if it is after you develop the Greenshell, like a little bit later in the game, the ability to play this and potentially get 2 lands out of it can allow you to meet that requirement very quick. And this is just a really cool card. I don't know just how viable this sort of win condition is going to be, but it's going to be interesting to see like what direction land-based decks with green take after rotation, because a big chunk of landfall as we know it is being rotated out. I'm talking about the Streets of Capina self-destructing lands. All of those are rotating out of standard. So we need a new phase for land-based ramp. And I think that Greenshell may end up being the face of that. And I am really excited for it, because it's a completely different approach, you know, and even though the Capina lands were, I think they were pretty cool. I know most of you are kind of tired of that strategy at this point and are looking forward to some new things. And I'm ready to embrace the turtle with the name I cannot pronounce. As then we go for the common good. For the common good is a sorcery, a rare sorcery that allows you to create X tokens that are copies of target token you control. Then tokens you control gain indestructible into your next turn. You gain 1 life for each token you control. Obviously, a card that's going to be working really well with spread out swarmy tactics, right? May they be rabbit or mouse oriented. I have to look at the colors again and see, but basically any sort of strategy that is generating a bunch of tokens will highly benefit from a card like this. But I look at a card like this and I'm more intrigued by its potential outside of that shell, and the ability for you to generate 2 copies of a token for 5 mana when combined with the right cards can lead to insane value. Because if you generate, like, if you have a deck that is able to generate high price tokens of like certain like artifacts or enchantments or who knows, even creatures, then this card can allow you to just generate 2 copies of that really high value token you have, and all of a sudden like you can just really pop off. Obviously, if you take this approach, then you know the life gain will be less, which may be an issue against aggressive decks. And, you know, your tokens gaining indestructible into your next turn, I mean, yeah, I mean, that applies. Like, even if it's not creatures and they're hard to interact with, it's nice to give them that. But the last 2 lines of the text are less, like, relevant, I think, overall, if you're going to take that approach with this card. But that's the one that excites me the most, because I've never been a huge... Like, it's not my favorite thing to do in Magic, generating like a bunch of little token dudes and spreading them out and buffing them. That the Selesnya playstyle essentially is not my favorite thing in the world, but I do like obscene stuff, and I think, yeah, don't take that out of context. And I think this card is capable of some obscene stuff, so it's overall a very exciting card that is quite flexible. I'd say more flexible than meets the eye, but I think if you look at this card, the flexibility within it, it's pretty obvious, so I'm not going to say that. As then we move on to the Galewind Moose, a 6 mana, this is a Timmy card, man, 6 mana, 6/6, with Flash, Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. It's nice in the sense that you can play this and surprise block a flyer, maybe like even a win condition flyer. I think this card is really going to shine in Limited, though. I do feel like it's very expensive, and the impact that it's having, even if you're playing it at Flash speed, because I'm used to playing anti-Flash, right? And that is just a significantly more impactful play than something like this. So I don't really know where this will land in Standard, and I feel like it's going to end up being a high-power card in Limited, but not really going to see much play within the constructed format. Correct me if I'm wrong, as then we have Hazard Root Herbalist, a 3-mana, 1/4 rabbit druid. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1 power until the end of turn. If that creature is a token, it also gains Death Touch until the end of turn. Seems very, like, non-impactful, really. Like, only just +1 power. Like, okay, you're getting something +1 power. You're not even giving it trample or anything. Like, you're giving it Death Touch, which, I mean, can work, I guess, with some creatures that have effects if they manage to connect onto the opponent's life points. But I just feel like the stat line is kind of weak if you're trying to go for, like, a rabbit deck and spreading out. I feel like there must be better options for rabbit decks than this. Like, maybe I'm missing the mark here, but I feel like this card is just not doing enough. And that's the hill I'm gonna sit on for now. I'm not gonna die on it, but I'm gonna hill on it. I'm gonna lay down on it, and we'll see. Heaped Harvest, the food ramp, ladies and gentlemen. 3-mana artifact food. When Heaped Harvest enters, and when you sacrifice it, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Then you tap 2. You tap this, you sack it, and you gain 3 life, like foods generally do. Like, functions the same way as a food does, but it's a specific type of food that allows you to ramp. And it does so when you play it and when you sack it, which is really cool. Like, I want to see, like, what's the potential for a ramp deck with food synergy. That sounds really fun, and, you know, you are also, like, generating tokens, so a lot of these cards, like, naturally being within the same set, are very well designed to go well with each other, but they're not, like, particularly, a lot of these cards aren't, like, super tied to something specific. As a deck builder, I fucking love that. So this is a card that I am, this is a kind of, like, archetype, rather, that I'm eager to explore, as I don't think I've yet to dabble into, like, food stuff since I came back to Magic, and I guess now's a good time to do that. As then we got the High Stride, 1 mana, target creature gets +1/+3 and gains reach until the end of turn. Untap it. More of a limited card, you know, it's a combat trick, but I do think there are better combat tricks overall. Like, I'd rather incorporate stuff for, like, from blue, for example, that provides, or even, like, green. What am I talking about? Like, this is also in green. Like, I prefer effects that give, like, hexproof or indestructible. Reach is a nice keyword to give to something at instant speed, but it's also the problem with cards like this is that it's also very, very matchup dependent. Like, you're much more likely to run into a deck that runs interaction than a deck that specifically has, like, threatening flyers, right? Like, that really depends. So this kind of card, you know, it's not the first time we see a card like this, and it won't be the last, but in constructed, don't expect to be able to use this too much. As then we got the Hive Spine Wolverine, a 5-mana 5/4. When it enters the battlefield, you choose one of these 3 abilities. The first one is honestly kind of lame. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Not getting much out of that. Let's see options 2 and 3. Wolverine fights target creature token. Has to be a token, though. Not a if it's just a regular creature, it doesn't work. What's option? I mean, yeah, that's not great either. What about option 3? Destroy target artifact or enchantment. There we go. That is a nice alternative option. But it's just not good enough. This is a 5-mana 5/4. The stats are not quite there, considering there's no keyword on top of that. It's just overall weak for the amount of mana you're paying for. It's supposed to make up for that, for the flexibility within the different types of options. Like, the ability is flexible. You can choose different things depending on different scenarios. But I'm just not impressed by the options. I think the options are either very fringe or weak. And I think, you know, the last one is good, but the first one and the second one just don't quite... It's just not quite it, man. So I think, yeah, you can justify this card in limited. Like I say, I'm every card that's, like, not standard viable. But I mean, just because a card is not standard viable doesn't mean that it's like, you know, even the cards, like, because just some cards, like, are not, like, I think a good example is this guy, right? I think Gilwyn Moose is not just going to be, like, viable, but it's actually going to be, like, a very legit card to draft in limited. But it's just not quite enough for standard, which is a higher pace of gaming. The thing about the High Spine Wolverine is I don't know if this card is even going to be that good and limited to begin with, to be honest. Like, it's just, I mean, it's all right. But it's also not. So let's just leave it there. Honored Dray Leader. Honored Dray Leader is a 3-mana 1/1 with trample. Whenever Honored Dray Leader enters, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other squirrel or food you control. When another squirrel or food you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on the Dray Leader. So this is a card that just goes tall. It just keeps pumping up, has trample to begin with, and you'd be surprised at how fast a card like this can go up. So I do think this card is definitely viable. This card has a lot of potential. It comes in on turn 3, so even if it does get removed, it can maybe leave the space open for something else, like an even more threatening win condition later down the line. And it's a card that if you do not answer, it's just going to keep on growing, and like I said, faster than you would expect, and it's going to just become a win condition on its own. So pretty damn solid card. Requires synergy, obviously, specific type of deck, but very nicely fine-tuned for that. As then we have Hunter's Talent. Now, when it comes to the classes, I think I'm least impressed by the green options out of all the colors, personally. First, we have the Hunter's Talent, which is 2-mana enchantment class. When it enters the battlefield, target creature you control deals damage to its power to target creature you don't control. This is an effect that we see a lot within green. The prime option for this in standard is the hard-hitting question, for the simple reason that you're able to do this for just 1 mana, even if it is a sorcery speed, which is the same speed at which something like this is. So it reigns supreme even over 2-mana instant variants of the same effect, just because, again, 1 mana less in Magic is a massive deal. So that's kind of the go-to card for this sort of effect. But the perk within Hunter's Talent is that, yes, you pay a little bit more, a lot more if you think about it. I mean, going from 1 to 2, it's a pretty big deal. But you pay more for the same effect, but then you have something sticking on the board that you can build towards, right? What are level 2 and 3 though? Because it's nice for the card to be able to provide you with more value, but how worth it is it, right? 2 mana, level 2, whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1 and gains trample to the end of the turn. I'm not crazy about this effect. I mean, I understand you can use this in I mean, don't get me wrong, it's in a creature-centric deck, this is a nice effect to have, and it's not particularly expensive, and it's a permanent effect on top of that, so it's not that bad, honestly. But level 3 is kind of okay, for 4 mana at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. You know, I may pull a bit of a 180 here. It's one of those things I don't know, reading the card again and just visualizing it a little bit more makes me doubt my initial position on it. Because this card could actually prove to be extremely good. It offers you removal, it gives you power to push through, and then in a dragged out game, it allows you to keep drawing fuel. The requirement in the right deck will be very easy to meet. This card could be very useful in a deck with Outcast or Trailblazer, for example. And it's expensive. Level 3 is overall expensive, but a lot of times you won't be needing to go for it. It's there as an option for a match that drags out and you're running out of gas. It's nice to have. Honestly, just the fact that this card is able to do all that, even if some of the options are a little bit expensive, and even if it is dependent on you having a board presence, I do think this card is actually pretty decent. This card is actually very decent, I think. Which goes against my initial impression of it. But sometimes you just gotta go over a card twice and actually think properly about it. And yeah, no, actually Hunter's Talent may be pretty alright. As then we got Innkeeper Talent, a 2-mana enchantment class, but this one is rare. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then, for 1 mana, you can level it up to 2. Permanents you control with counters on them have Ward 1. Interesting effect. This is an effect that's just happening every combat. So once you develop this, from that point onwards, you're going to be able to boost your board. And this could synergize really well with the Ornery Tumblewag, for example. As it's another source that's just constantly developing counters and enables protection for your countered units. Or your modified units, rather. So that's interesting. Then for 4 mana, you can level it to 3. If you would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kind of counters on that permanent or player instead. Expensive level 3, but naturally very snowbally. I think the Hunter's Talent is ultimately better than this. Though they belong in different decks, so they could potentially go well together as well. One is uncommon, one is rare, but it's one of those cases where I think the uncommon is just overall more impressive. And Innkeeper's Talent is like more limited to the kind of decks you can incorporate it in. But there's a lot of +1/+1 counter synergy within Bloomburrow, so this card is definitely going to have a lot of potential. And sometimes I rate cards a little bit lower than they deserve, maybe, just because it's kind of harder to evaluate them without properly testing them. And this is one of those cards, really. I can't really tell you if this card is actually amazing or mediocre, but I think obviously it's landing somewhere between those two, but I really need to test it. Until I test it, I can't really say. I got to get brewing with it, but it is a card that I'm actually particularly excited to try out. You know, I do like counter gameplay, not the blue kind, the base type, the green one. And yeah, I'm eager to try that out, but I can't really say more about this card. I do think my Hunter's Talent is better than I initially thought it was, though. All it took was reading it a second time. As then we got the Keen-Eyed Curator. Remember what I said about green having really big creatures? It being the Timmy faction? This is a pretty nice example of that. Keen-Eyed Curator is a 2-mana 3/3. I remember back in my day, we're talking about when I was a young teenager and I was playing Magic the Gathering. I remember this elf that was a 2-mana. It was 2 green sources, but you got a 2-mana 2/3. And it had no ability, but it was played. I think, you know, this is a great example of how far power creep has gone, but considering how much time it's passed, like that's nothing. That's like a nothing burger regarding power creep compared to something like Yu-Gi-Oh, right? But it is prevalent. It is a thing here. 2-mana 3/3. That's a lot. In case you're wondering, that's kind of a crazy stat line for 2-mana. As long as there are 4 or more card types among card exiles with the Keen-Eyed Curator, it gets +4/+4 and has trample. But wait, there's more. And then for 1 mana, exile target card from a graveyard. An activated ability that can be activated at instant speed, in case you're wondering. This card is pretty bananas. Like this card is pretty wild. Yeah. Where do I even start? Overstated. Like a 3/3 for 2 mana is very hard to find. It is balanced by the fact that you require 2 sources of green. That makes it so that this card will generally play in green heavy decks or mono green. But man, that graveyard interaction, that cheap graveyard interaction. Yes, it costs mana, but you can activate it whenever. You can wait for your opponent to go for like a resurrection spell or something to return something from their graveyard, and then you can chain this effect and counter it essentially. Very strong. It's a Raccoon, so you can you damn well know that there's going to be synergy for Raccoons in this expansion. So it's just like a staple. Like this card for any sort of like Raccoon deck, I think this card is a staple. For mono green, I think this card is a legit contender, like something you have to consider just because of the very reliable graveyard interaction within it, and the fact that you get a payoff with it as well. Like if this card does not get answered and it sticks on the board for enough, it'll turn into a 7. It'll upgrade for the late game and become a 7/7 with trample. That can win games. So I don't know what more you want about this. Like the only downside to this thing is that it requires 2 sources of green. That's what's technically balancing it, right? But if you build the deck properly, man, this could fit into some decks that you know, maybe it shouldn't be in. And yeah, it's at least in a vacuum, this card is nuts. We'll see how it actually performs in standard, but very, very promising 2-drop for the Raccoon faction. And then we have Longstalk Brawl. Longstalk Brawl is a 1-mana sorcery. You can gift a tapped fish And then it says choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. Put a +1/+1 counter on the creature you control. If the gift was promised, then those creatures fight each other. Remember what I mentioned with the hard-hitting question? The hard-hitting question is a 1-mana sorcery that allows you to hit something with one of your creatures equal to its power. It doesn't fight. Fighting means that both of them engage. So would you rather like have you and the other person punch each other in the face, or would you rather like slap them before they can do anything? Probably the latter. So that's kind of the reason why this card, you know, it's just an inferior version of hard-hitting question. And honestly, I think it's kind of weak outside of that as well. Like having to gift just for a +1/+1 counter. I mean, it's high tempo, but not really, because you're giving your opponent a body as well. And I'm not crazy about this. I mean, I guess it's an option for draft, but yeah, it seems like a pretty weak. There are better cards to play that fit that role within green, is what I'm saying. As then we got Lumra, Bellow of the Woods. Ladies and gentlemen, the Elemental Bear. This card seems pretty fun. Vigilance and Reach. We see double stars because the power and toughness of Lumra is equal to the number of lands you control. You know, we go back to the I forgot the name, the turtle and the frog who ramps. You know, there's a lot of neat ramp tools given to us with Bloomburrow for standard, but this is a crazy payoff. Remember all those self-mill cards that we've seen related to like squirrel cards? We're getting a lot of that as expansion. And ladies and gentlemen, this is something to do or to look forward to when you build up your graveyard through these cards by turn 6. When Lumra enters, you mill 4 cards and then you return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It's just like the detective. God, I've been like a month back in Magic, so I just cannot remember all the names. But the 2-mana 1/3 upon entry mills you 3 cards. You pay 4 mana, you sack it, and you return all your lands to the graveyard tapped from the Murders at Karlov Manor expansion. You know, he's sitting like this. Like, I literally know everything about this card. I know it's an elf as well. It's an elf detective. It's like, I literally know everything about this card except for its name, which is kind of ridiculous. But, you know, I think at this point you know what card I'm talking about. You know, this card... The thing is, for both cards, in order to trigger the effect, you have to pay 6 mana in total, right? So this is coming in as it doesn't have trample, but it has vigilance and reach. It becomes massive, and it just allows you to bring back all of the lands you milled. I cannot wait to design a mill land wrap deck with this card that allows me to just bring back all sorts of lands, man lands at that. You know, like for example, like the cottage. And allowing you to just overwhelm the opponent with just tremendous mana superiority. And I'm really excited for that. This also kind of like becomes, it is chump blockable, but it does become a threat that you can't really ignore because it has vigilance as well, and it has reach. You know, that allows you to make sure that this card will not become useless in like a spread out board state with a bit of a stalemate going on, because you will be able to block into their flyers if they're trying to go over you. And you will be able to constantly attack them with a really big creature that demands to be blocked every single time. But the upon entry effect is the crazy thing. The fact that this card also mills you 4, you know, it really reminds you of the elf detective, right? And you can run both in the same deck, and that's honestly, that may be one of the very first things that I do with green. Figure out, you know, some crazy like land synergy, you know, self-mill and then just bring all the lands and then just go nuts, go bananas with crazy amount of mana, with lands with specific abilities that can just net you value as well. And it's just dope. Maybe put in Bristy Bill in there too. Like, I'm already cooking. I just saw this guy and I'm already cooking, man. Really exciting card. It's just a cool card, honestly. I personally really like it. Mist Breath. English. Elder. 1 mana 2/2. Not bad. At the beginning of your upkeep, return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on the Elder. Otherwise, you may return the Elder to its owner's hand. So you may. So if you don't return something else, you can also choose not to return the Mistbreath Elder, in case you're wondering. It's a frog. We've already mentioned that frogs seem to have bouncing synergy, aka like returning cards or exiling them and returning onto the battlefield, aka like the ability to re-trigger upon entry effects. That's something that frogs are going to synergize with overall. And we have a 1-drop here that will just already has a really good stat line for 1 mana and will continue to grow after that whenever you recall any of the other creatures you have. So yeah, pretty decent 1-drop, honestly. I'm not surprised it's a rare. Like, what more do you want? It's a beast of a 1-drop, man. As we got Overprotect. Overprotect is a 2-mana instant. Target creature you control gets +3/+3 and gains trample, hexproof, and indestructible until the end of turn. We've seen combat tricks like this. You know, this is doing quite a bit, but I just feel like there are cheaper and more reliable options within green. So outside of limited, I don't think this card will make the cut. This one, on the other hand, is a really interesting card. The Paw Patch Formation is a 2-mana instant with 3 different options. You can choose one of these effects. Destroy target creature with flying for 2 mana, very nice. Destroy target enchantment. We've seen cards like this before with these two, but look at the third one. Draw a card, create a food token. In a food deck, I think this is a very legitimate option to consider to add onto the deck. If not in the sideboard, if we're like, because in the sideboard, it's definitely like very easy to debate incorporating this, like, but I'd argue that also in Best of 1 Magic the Gathering Arena, this card will be very relevant in the right deck because of the fact that you're able to generate a food token while cycling through your deck as well. Like, that is a solid option to go for. In a deck that synergizes with food tokens, this is a very reliable way to generate them while drawing through your deck and finding your other pieces. While on top of that, being an option that can allow you to destroy a very key threat, whether it's a flying creature or an enchantment. And that's honestly, like, the fact that those two options are combined with the last one is really what makes this card just good enough for standard, and I actually really like it. I think if I'm going to make a green-based food deck, I will definitely consider this card as an addition because there's just a lot of matchups in which this card can be absolutely stellar. And in the ones that, you know, you don't really have targets for the first 2 options, the third one, as long as you got solid food synergy going on, is also, you know, just good enough as a play as well. So there's not, when it comes to like 2-mana instants that have multiple options, this is really up there. And at least in standard, you know, not going to be talking about other formats, but it's a very, very well designed and honestly seems like a strong card, like one of the stronger ones with like multiple options that's able to be played early on. So I really dig it, and I'll be experimenting with it for sure. Paw Patch Recruit is a 1-mana 2/1 Rabbit Warrior with Offspring 2. You know, all these rabbits are like, if we've learned anything about Bloomburrow, man, is that these creatures, they reproduce a lot. You know, they yeah, it's to be expected from, you know, small mammals, right? Like they're more about quality than quantity, or quantity over quality rather. And here we have another example. Another creature with Offspring, a 1-mana 2/1 with Trample. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control other than that creature. So if you're triggering the Offspring, you get to generate 2 Paw Patch Recruits, which will both be triggering whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, which will allow you to spread out even more stats. Because this is dependent on the opponent, this is an ability that depends on your opponent's decisions rather than yours. You have like less say over it. It may seem overall weaker, but you have to look at this card as a way for you to apply pressure to the opponent and punish them for interaction. That's the whole point of this card. Like, you cannot like rely on this card to generate you the stats and the strength to break the opponent down. You have to look at it as like a nice early threat that can apply pressure and can allow you to overcome highly interactive opponents. And, you know, a lot of times you may end up just going for the 1 mana 2/1 play just to get this early on and start attacking with it. But if you're facing a more reactive matchup, then you can preserve it for the offspring play and try to really make use of this effect in that case and punish the opponent for trying to remove your creatures one by one. Which is the kind of situation in which this card will ultimately shine. And because of those specific scenarios, I do think that a card like this does have a lot of potential. And I'm already at 45 minutes. What the hell? All right, Peerless Recycling, 2 mana. Gift a card. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand if the gift was promised. Instead, return 2 target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. For 2 mana, it's like, oh, return 2 cards from your graveyard to your hand. That seems pretty decent, but drawing your opponent a card, that's always gonna feel bad, man. I'm not super impressed with this as an option. You know, there's a big difference between returning something from your graveyard to the battlefield as just like returning something to the graveyard to the hand. Like, I think there's a big difference between that. And ultimately, I do think this card is underwhelming because of like gifting a card is a big price to pay there. Though I could be wrong about it. Polywallop is a 4 mana instant common. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each frog you control. It could cost 1 mana. Target creature you control deals damage to equal to twice its power to target creature you don't control. Now, I mentioned hard-hitting question. This card, if you're able to play it for 1 mana, is undoubtedly better than hard-hitting question. So, because not only are you able to deal like twice the damage equal to the power, unlike hard-hitting question, which only deals equal to the power, but also because it's instant speed. And having this be instant speed could be absolutely nuts, right? If hard-hitting question was instant speed, it would be broken. So keep that in mind. So in a deck with frogs, if you manage to have 3 frogs on the board, this becomes that. The question is it too much of a requirement? Like, is having 3 frogs on the board in order for this to cost 1 mana, or even 2 to cost 2 mana, like, is working for that too much of a requirement for this card to, you know, be reliable on a consistent basis? I think it could be. I think, you know, considering how we've seen like a lot of frogs are low curve, this card could be relatively easy to enable. And in that case, we could have the case of like a common card like this actually being extremely reliable and powerful. So, you know, if this card is viable, obviously it'll be in frog dedicated decks. And, you know, it could be the case. Like, it being an instant is a really, really big deal. I like the design of it overall. As then we got Rush Shield Rampager. Rush Shield Rampager is a 4 mana 4/4 with Offspring 2. This creature cannot be blocked with creatures with power 2 or less. Weak. Maybe has some use in limited, but just overall weak, unfortunately. This guy's not weak though. Oh my goodness. Oh my god. The Scrap Shooter. Remember when I said the 3 mana 3/4 was impressive? A 3 mana 4/4 is naturally even more so. Gift a card. You can actually gift your opponent a card, and then you get a payoff. Let's see what that is. A 4/4 with Reach for 3 mana. That already is really good. Like, this card could have nothing else in the text, and that would already be something to consider. But then on top of that, when Scrap Shot enters, if the gift was promised, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. So this card gives you the ability to shut down like a game-winning artifact or enchantment in those specific matchups. You will be drawing your opponent a card, but you still will be able to deal with something that's very relevant and otherwise hard to remove. And the vast majority of the time, this card will be exactly what it seems. A 3 mana 4/4 with Reach. So it can block into flyers. And like I said, that is good enough. Like, that's a really high stat line. Like, yes, we have examples in Standard of like a 3 mana 4/5, I believe. But this is still really big. It's a Raccoon, which there's a lot of synergy with Raccoons, not only with this color, but within the expansion itself. And, you know, I just don't know what more you want out of this, man. It has Reach, so flyers cannot ignore it, right? It's just a big, beefy play that is going to outmuscle most of what your opponent is going to be developing on turn 3. And it synergizes with a tribe within the expansion that is very like developed, right? Like there's just a lot going on for it. There's a lot of cards that synergize with Raccoons, and overall it's just a really, really strong card for the most obvious of reasons, really. Like I don't think I need to ramble on anymore about it, but that card good, right, Timmy? Hear me out. That card good. Season of Gathering, 6 mana sorcery. We have the paw green version. Choose up to 5 paws worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once, so you can go 5 of the first option, you can go 1 of the second option and 3 of the first option, you can go 1 of the third option and 1 of the second option, you can go 1 of the first option and 2 of the second option. As you can see, there's several ways in which you can mix this, right? For 1 paw, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and it gets Vigilance and Trample. That's actually a lot. That's a lot for just like 1. The fact that you can do that 5 times is pretty wild. For 2 paws, you can choose artifact or enchantment and destroy all permanents of the chosen type. So if you're facing like a specific, matchup with artifacts or enchantments, this card can actually be a win card against them. But the fact that it gives you options in other matchups is very nice. And then the third option allows you to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So you can go for 1 paw onto 1 creature, pump it up, and then go for the option 3, choose that creature, and draw cards equal to its power. And it seems like a lot, but you're paying 6 mana to do this, right? So you cannot just fit this card in any deck by any means. It's a very slow sorcery. Expensive rather, and it does have a big impact, and it is flexible, which is nice, and it can generate you a lot of value too. But again, it's 6 mana, so I think this card will shine more in a deck that is capable of some sort of ramping, or at least a deck that is able to slow down aggression very efficiently. In that case, I do think this card will have potential in those kind of decks, and overall has a lot of power within it. But again, it's 6 mana, so you got to keep that in mind. As then we got Sticky Tongue Sentinel, a 3 mana frog warrior. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target permanent you control to its owner's hand. It just comes in and bounces something. I think we have overall better options for this role, though, specifically within blue, I'm sure. It is a common, so yeah, you can incorporate some bouncing synergies within limited, and I think that's what this card is made for. But not quite for constructed. You want more out of your 3-drop, I think, personally. As then we got Stocking the Pantry, 1 mana enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, you put a supply counter on Stocking the Pantry. You remove 2 of them to remove a supply counter for Stocking the Pantry to draw a card. So we got a card draw engine. A card draw engine that is gonna synergize with you being able to develop counters. Right? We've seen this with some of the enchantment classes within here. There's a lot of +1/+1 counters synergies within the expansion as a whole. So this is a very nice early game engine to just invest into. For just 1 mana, you put this in, and then you're just able to potentially keep drawing and drawing and drawing throughout the match whenever you have the spare mana and the build up to do so. And I think that will definitely be useful in the right kind of deck. Sunshower Druid is a 1 mana 0/2 frog druid. Has an amazing art. Honestly, I loved everything about this art. Whenever the druid enters, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and you gain 1 life. So this could become a 1/3 for 1 mana that gains you 1 life upon entry. It's not the craziest thing you've ever seen, but it's not a weak effect either. I think despite this being a common, there is potential for this card to actually be played in like a frog bounce deck that is like a low curve, and you're able to just spread out and just pump up the creatures that you don't want to bounce and bounce everything else. So yeah, I think it's actually pretty decent. As then we got Tender Wild Guide. The Tender Wild Guide is a 2 mana 2/2 with Offspring 2. It taps to allow you to add 1 mana of any color, and also it can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. And with the Offspring, you can generate the 1/1 copy of it. So if you pay 4 mana, then you have 2 of these that will allow you to ramp even further. This can snowball really hard. And it's definitely the kind of card that you want in a deck that is capable of ramping out and wants to be able to generate as much mana as possible, as quickly as possible. This card is specifically designed for that kind of shell, and I think it'll be really good in the proper build. But there's more. There's more cards like this. Now we're seeing a lot of mana effects here, as we got the Thorn Vault Forager, a 2-mana 2/2 Squirrel Ranger that allows you to add green tapping. But also, if you forage, which allow sacrifice a food or exile 3 cards, you can add 2 mana in any combination of colors. But there's more. You can tap. You have an activated ability of tapping 4 and this to search your library for any squirrel card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you're making a squirrel deck, you're playing this. I don't think I have to explain why, man. It's just yeah. This is really good. 3/3 Root Weaver. You know, the poor man's version of the cards that we just saw. Quite simply. 3/3 Scribe, a 2-mana 2/3 Frog Druid. Whenever this or another creature you control leaves the battlefield without dying, aka bouncing, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. A 2/3 for 2. I think that's good enough for like a dedicated frog bounce deck. That's a solid 2-drop to consider, if you ask me. Tree Guard Druid is a 4-mana 3/4. When it enters at the end of the turn, target creature you control gains vigilance and gets +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. More of a limited card, really. Slow and overall underwhelming for standard, I think. As then we got Tree Trop Sentries, 4-mana 2/4 reach. When Tree Trop Sentries enters, you may forage. If you do, draw a card. Same explanation for this one. These treetop cards will shine in a draft format. And then we got the Valley Mightcaller, 1-mana 1/1 out there. God, I'm running out of time. 1-mana 1/1 trample. Whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on Valley Mightcaller. So a 1/1 that just keeps on growing and has trample and synergizes. Again, we've seen one of these cards in every color so far. You know, a card that synergizes with multiple different tribes. And these are amongst the cards that I'm personally most excited for because they offer more options from a deck building perspective. And this one is just the good old early game snowbally Timmy beatdown win condition version of it. And, you gotta love it for that. As then, last but not least, we got Wear Down. 2-mana sorcery with the gift a card mechanic. Destroy target artifact or enchantment if the gift was promised. Instead, you can destroy a total of 2. I think there are better options than this. I said it not least, but honestly, this card seems pretty underwhelming. You know, it's very limited. I'd rather, instead of this, I'd rather always play the one with the different mode options that allows you to also destroy or generate a food or destroy a creature with flying. Even if we don't have the ability to destroy an artifact with this one, I think Paw Patch Formation is an example of a much stronger version of a card like this. And ladies and gentlemen, that's green. We covered green. We have just multicolored left to go, but we're about to go over the limit. We're at 57 minutes, so I'm going to end it here, and tomorrow we'll be uploading the multicolored video, and then we'll get back to gameplay. We're going to be tackling the expansion from the get-go, and I'm going to give you guys, hopefully really dope decks that showcase the new cards. I'm going to do my best to optimize them and make sure they're ready to go, and I hope you guys are excited for that because I can't wait. I've been waiting for this. I've been on like mentally. I've been like just purely waiting for this expansion to just really pop off, and I'm eager. I'm eager to showcase what I got to offer in that sense. So thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for daily Magic the Gathering content. Hope you enjoyed today's podcasty kind of video. This kind of content I know is not for everybody, but I love rambling about cards, and I know a lot of you enjoy it too. So love you. Have a soul day. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow.